So, you got sucked dry, licked a toad, cut loose with an emo chick, had a magical night, danced with the devil, had a steamy session full of fiery passion, got scratches up and down your back, and you got blacked. You've exhausted everything there is to do in Baldur's Gate 3. But wait, 3? Does that mean there's 2 more games out there where people will play with your default penis? Well, not exactly, but they're pretty fun anyway. Now, I don't think these first 2 games in the series are for everyone who enjoyed Baldur's Gate 3, but I am here to break them down and give you an idea of whether or not you're someone who would enjoy them. First off, you're likely going to want to play the enhanced editions on Steam or whatever other modern launcher. They're easily accessible and they offer a few new things while staying true to the original experience. Let's start with the most obvious difference between the older games and Baldur's Gate 3, the age. Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 certainly don't look anywhere near as good as the third installment, but they do have one major thing going for them, and that's the isometric perspective. The games don't try to be hyper-realistic with their visuals. There aren't any close-ups of characters, and cinematics are few and far between. Some of the spells have decent visuals, but the best thing I can say for how the games look is that the graphics aren't ever distractingly bad. I'm sure they'll be a deal breaker for some people, but you can see for yourself what you're getting into right away. Where these games don't feel old is the writing and the music. Characters feel unique, they feel alive, they have a real purpose in the world. The musical scores help set a theme and tone that carries throughout the entire experience. Still to this day, I think these games stand above a lot of modern games in these 2 areas. Of course, they're still limited by very little voice acting and lower quality of the sounds themselves, but I don't think this is an area you should be too worried about if you're looking to try the games out. Now let's talk gameplay. One immediate difference you'll notice is that Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 do use Dungeons & Dragons as their rule set, but they're using 2nd edition rules instead of 5th. If you're not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons outside of Baldur's Gate 3, the best way I can describe the difference between these 2 editions is that 5th edition feels like a clean, sanitized system, and it's the easiest edition to learn, while 2nd edition is awkward and unintuitive at first, but it has some cool ideas and depth for hardcore nerds like myself. Coming from Baldur's Gate 3, I would not be intimidated by this change of edition. You might hear people chatter about how needlessly complicated 2nd edition is to learn, but if you've already learned 5th edition, it's really not going to be that huge of an adjustment. Sometimes smaller numbers are better than bigger numbers, and you're going to need an external reference table for your attributes when you're making your character, but the rest really should come pretty easily as you play. I think this whole point is often overstated since it's how a lot of people, including myself, were first introduced to Dungeons & Dragons, and it was pretty damn overwhelming at the time. Larian, however, has made it so much easier to learn in Baldur's Gate 3 that I think going backwards just isn't a huge concern. Where a lot of people may drop off is the difference in combat. Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 have a real-time with pause system where all characters' turns are loosely played out in real time, but it allows players to pause at any time to issue more complicated commands and strategize. Basically, it's much slower than an action game like Diablo, but way faster than a turn-based game like BG3. I think if you're a fan of Larian and what they did with Divinity Original Sin, as well as Baldur's Gate 3 when it comes to combat, you'll really need to look at whether or not this shift in combat style appeals to you. Personally, I feel like the real-time with pause system they implemented feels great for Dungeons & Dragons combat. It allows for much faster combat in most cases, especially at early levels, which equates to far more but shorter combats over the entire course of the game. I think this is also a nice way to get introduced to 2nd edition since those early combats are mostly just you clicking on 1 or 2 enemies and letting your characters go to work. There are difficulty settings and some options to control things like how many hit points you get when leveling up, but the base difficulty setting is pretty tough. I'd say it's probably closer to what you get from Tactician in Baldur's Gate 3, so you're going to want to adjust accordingly. Maybe the biggest difference between these older games and Baldur's Gate 3 is just how much room you have for creativity. Larian has nailed this with previous Divinity games and turned it up to 11 in Baldur's Gate 3, but it's really not something you see at all in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. You do have multiple dialogue options, you got different ways to complete quests, there's this reputation system, and characters are going to react to your choices, sometimes even outright leaving your party if they disagree with you. All of that is pretty good for a standard RPG, but it doesn't come close to what you can achieve in Baldur's Gate 3. I can't even begin to list all of the things I'm referring to here. This is stuff like barrelmancy, jumping up cliffs, pushing people off cliffs, using illusions as distractions, combining the elements. I mean, if you can think of doing it, you can almost be sure Baldur's Gate 3 will let you do it. Now, this isn't to say Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 are lacking, but you need to be aware that the creativity on display in Baldur's Gate 3 is a Larian staple and not one of the series itself. Also, there's no dicks and stuff.